Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. Welcome to all, and thank you for joining our virtual event today to mark Global Accessibility Awareness Day. My name is Tom Varghese. I'm the head of Connectivity and Access Policy for Facebook in Asia Pacific, and I'll be your moderator today. Before I start, I'd like to thank our co-hosts, GSMA, for partnering with us to bring this program and event together. Together, we hope that this event will help to bring awareness to and focus on addressing the issues around digital access and inclusion for millions of people with disabilities and impairments in the Asia-Pacific region, particularly for those of us in South Asia. Today is an important day for the accessibility community. And as many of you know, accessible digital solutions are a critical preconditions for persons with disabilities to live independently and participate fully in an increasingly digital world. With the COVID-19 pandemic forcing all of us to go online and engage virtually, it's all the more important that the tools and tech we take for granted are also accessible and available for use by persons with disabilities. I'd like to keep my intro short as we have an engaging session ahead with a group of eminent speakers from the region who will share their experiences and ideas about what are the achievement, challenges, and opportunities for improving digital accessibility. We will kick off with a presentation from GSMA, followed by a video from Facebook before we go into our panel discussion. Just a few practical things to note. Whilst we will have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the program, please feel free to send us your questions at any time during this webinar by selecting the Q&A button on your screen, and we will answer the questions during that segment. To improve accessibility, we've also closed captioning available, which you may enable through the CC button on your screen. We will have a sign language interpreter on screen at all times. The meeting will be recorded and the link shared on our social media pages. With that, let's get things started. I'd like to introduce our co-hosts and first two speakers, Mr. Michael Neek, Senior Director, Assistive Tech, and Ms. Clara Arandayan, Insights Manager, Assistive Tech from the GSMA. Please go ahead, Michael and Clara.
Thanks, Tom, and hi, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here today with you to celebrate this Accessibility Awareness Day. So I am Michael Neek. I am the Senior Director for the GSMA Assistive Tech Program. So the GSMA is the trade association of the mobile phone operators globally. And our work on assistive tech is focused on driving the digital inclusion of persons with disabilities worldwide. I'm gonna move to the next slide. Here you go. So first, I would like you to consider this first slide. So on this picture, there is a young man standing in front of a green background with trees. He has short, dark, a bit curly hair, and he's wearing a blue shirt. He's also wearing an hearing aid, and he appears to be signing at his smartphone. So his name is Tasun, and he's part of the Sumaga Ruhunu Circle of the Deaf in Sri Lanka. We came across Tasun earlier this year when we conducted a study in Sri Lanka to better understand how persons with disabilities have access to mobile phones and use mobile services. This study will be published later this year. I wanted to pause here because I think this slide and this picture illustrates quite well the work we're doing part of GSMA Assistive Tech. We are living in a digital world, and smartphones are the places increasingly where we live. We also know that with the COVID crisis, we are even more reliant on these mobile internet platforms, apps that you mentioned, Tom, to access critical information, opportunities, and to come together and connect. So our work as GSMA Assistive Tech is first to raise awareness about the potential of mobile phones as bespoke and cost-effective tools for persons with disabilities, because they are clustering together multiple assistive technology into one single device. So we work with mobile operators because we do believe they have a strong role to play to ensure everyone have access to mobile phones and can get online through their mobile devices independently of their abilities. Because we also know that this is a challenge for many persons with disabilities worldwide. There was very little evidence so far on the nexus of mobile and disability. And our research has found that many systemic barriers exist for persons with disabilities to get online, and accessibility is one of them. And that there is a risk of further exclusion if we don't come together to address these issues. So I would like now to ask my colleague Clara Aranda to give you a few more insights around the reality of digital inclusion of persons with disabilities and how research has shown this unequal access. Clara?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Michael, for the introduction. My name is Clara Aranda, and I'm an Insights Manager for the GSMA Assistive Tech Program. So, as Michael said, part of our work has been focused on trying to understand what is the digital inclusion of people with disabilities. We look at it from the perspective of what we call is the customer journey for mobile internet use. In our framework, so this is our framework for digital inclusion, we consider 4 different stages. The first one is mobile ownership. The second one is mobile internet awareness. The third one is mobile internet adoption. And the final one is regular use of mobile internet. So in terms of mobile ownership, our data has shown us that a mobile disability gap exists. This means that people with disabilities are significantly less likely to own a mobile phone compared to people without disabilities. Now, using the data from the GSMA Intelligence Consumer Survey, we have identified gaps in Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, which are the countries where we have collected data with the surveys. We introduced the Washington Group questions in the data when we collected the data for these countries. And we found that the mobile disability gap in ownerships in these countries are as follows. In Bangladesh, it's 47%. In India, it's 23%. And in Pakistan, it's 28%. Now, what is interesting is that these gaps become larger when we look at smartphone ownership. So in the same order, the mobile disability gap in terms of smartphone ownership is 73% in Bangladesh, 55% in India, and it is 71% in Pakistan. Now, it is important for us also to consider the role that gender plays in digital inclusion. We know from the data gathered by the GSMA that women are significantly less likely to own a mobile phone and be digitally included in general. When we consider both gender and disabilities, the combination of the factors become even more significant. So our data indicates that women with disabilities are at greater risk of being digitally excluded. And this is particularly the case in the 3 Asian countries where we gather the data. So we see that in Bangladesh, in India, and in Pakistan, women with disabilities have the lowest levels of mobile ownership in these 3 markets. Sorry, okay, so an important indicator for us of digital inclusion is whether people are aware of mobile internet. People with disabilities in general are less aware of mobile internet compared to people without disabilities. However, for us, in our data, it's interesting to see that in countries like India, the levels of awareness between people with and without disabilities are very similar. Mobile internet awareness is one of the important factors that define whether someone becomes a user and adopts mobile internet. Now, in Pakistan and in Bangladesh, where we identify large gaps in terms of mobile internet awareness, we see that the levels of adoption amongst people with disabilities are significantly lower than the levels of adoption amongst people without disabilities. However, in India, where I mentioned that the levels of awareness are similar between both groups, we see that the gaps in adoption are much smaller. So this for us means that once you're able to tackle some of the barriers towards digital inclusion of people with disabilities, there is no reason why people with disabilities cannot be equal users of mobile internet. In terms of accessibility features, we gather data in 2 countries, in Bangladesh and in Kenya. And we asked people whether they were aware about the accessibility features in their phones. What we found interesting is that when we look at all people with disabilities with all the types of phones, only around 10% of people in both markets, in Bangladesh and Kenya, mentioned that they were aware of accessibility features. Now, this proportion becomes a little bit larger when we look at smartphone owners. Now, if we look at people with visual impairment that own a smartphone, then the proportions are larger. But in Bangladesh, the proportion is 64%, and in Kenya is 40%, around 40%. But there is still a proportion of people that own a smartphone and that are not aware of accessibility features. All this, all the research that we've identified, that we have conducted, it's quite important because it has also helped us highlight that there are barriers that exist for the digital inclusion of people with disabilities. We categorize them in 5 different groups. Access, making sure that accessible mobile products and services are available to them is a barrier. The cost of data and the cost of owning a smartphone are also barriers. Now, relevance is another barrier. Ensuring that there is relevant content, relevant products that people with disabilities can use, it's also a significant barrier. Knowledge and skills, ensuring that people have the literacy levels, but also have the knowledge and of the digital skills that they require to be able to use a mobile phone and use mobile internet, that's also a barrier. And the final barrier is safety and security. The way in which we design our mobile products and our mobile services sometimes can put the privacy and the security of our users at risk. At the GSMA, we are very interested in understanding how we can support users to improve their digital skills. So we have developed the Mobile Internet Skills Training Toolkit, which is a module. It's a free resource that you can find online that provides support for people to be able to learn smartphone skills, but also learn about different internet applications. And more recently, we developed content for people to be able to learn about accessibility features. Last year, on the International Day of Persons with Disabilities in December, we also launched the principles for the digital inclusion of people with disabilities. Now, these principles, we categorize them in 3. And the idea is that we're able to provide a framework for action for the mobile industry to be able to reduce the gap in access and the gap in usage of mobile-enabled services for people with disabilities. I invite you to go to our website and look at our resources online. You will be able to find our different reports with all of our insights. And I just want to finally thank the UK8, the British government, for the support provided for us to be able to do this work. Thank you.
Thanks, Clara. And just to mention, we will stick around until the end of the session if you have any questions for us in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the insightful presentation. I think the findings really underscore the importance of connectivity and inclusion and all of the important work that's being undertaken to bridge these gaps. We will now play a video featuring Facebook's head of accessibility, Mike Shebanek, sharing details about Facebook's accessibility efforts around awareness, action, and advocacy.
Hi, I'm Mike Shebanek, the head of accessibility here at Facebook. I want to thank you for joining us today. Accessibility is fundamental to achieving our corporate mission, which is to give people the power to build community and bring the world closer together. And it's paramount to achieving true digital inclusion. Facebook serves nearly 3 billion people globally, and that's an easy number to say, but it's breathtaking in its impact. And within the Facebook community, there are hundreds of millions of people who rely on assistive tools and technologies to experience the information and connections that happen on Facebook. We like to say that our journey is only ever 1% finished. It's a way of reminding ourselves to never rest or be satisfied, and that there's always opportunity to improve and advance. And this is true for accessibility as well. We are always listening and actively engaged with disability communities, looking for ways to improve the accessibility of our products. Our engagement with disability communities around the world informs how we advocate, represent, and raise awareness of people with disabilities and our work to promote economic opportunities and employment. Today, I want to share with you 3 themes that I think you'll find in our accessibility work: awareness, action, and advocacy. Let me start with awareness. The disability community has a popular saying called "nothing about us without us," and we take this to heart. So for us, awareness begins with research, engagement, and consultation with disability communities. Here's just one example. In January, we launched a major update to one of our signature features called Automatic Alt Text. It's powered by AI and computer vision and creates text descriptions of photos on Facebook automatically. But before this launch, we ran multiple rounds of research, not just to learn how people were using it, but how they wanted to use it. We conducted surveys, one-on-one interviews, did early prototyping, and even ran multiple experiments. What we learned was interesting. People wanted access to deeper details about an image, like the count of recognized objects or the position of objects in a photo and their relative size. But not all the time, only for the photos that interested them. So we responded by creating a new feature that provides these details on request only when they're needed. And ultimately, as a result of all this research, we were able to improve our image recognition by over 10%. Sorry, not just 10%, by 10 times. We also know that the importance of sign language for the deaf and hard of hearing community, and recently took our accessibility research team on a 9-day trip to Brazil to learn firsthand how being deaf or using sign language affects a person's interactions on social media. As a result, we not only better understand how this community is using video clips as an easy way to share and communicate in sign language, we also got a much deeper appreciation for the level of difficulty of simply holding a phone or staying in camera while signing. Now, what we learn from engagements like this changes how we think about future product features and our roadmaps, and also reinforces some of the decisions we've made. Our portal communication device turns out to be well suited to address this need. It has a built-in camera system that automatically adjusts focus and keeps you in frame even when you're moving, which makes it perfect for sign language. Now, we also continue to work closely with disability rights and advocacy organizations to understand the most pressing needs of the disability communities and how Facebook can better address them in its products, tools, and advocacy. So how are we turning awareness into action? Well, last year, we completely re-engineered and modernized the Facebook website, which enabled us to improve the experience for people using screen readers. Screen readers are an assistive technology that enable people who are blind and low vision to understand and use mobile apps and web pages. We simplified and reorganized heading tags that are used for navigation. We improved the accessibility labels, and we redesigned the keyboard shortcuts to make them easier to find and use. Over the last year, we also made significant improvements in captioning. In addition to enabling people to manually upload captions to a video, we also provide automatically generated captions powered by AI at the touch of a button. We even provide caption editing tools so creators have full control and can tune these captions if they like. With the growth and popularity of video blogging and live streaming, especially as we've all been learning, working, and staying in touch remotely, we recently introduced auto-generated captions for live events. So now people using FB Live, Workplace Live, and Instagram's IGTV can enable captions for their audiences in 16 languages. And we'll be including support for captions in our recently announced suite of audio-based applications. We're also continuing to improve accessibility in our family of apps like Instagram, Messenger, and WhatsApp. In fact, just a few months ago, we enabled a talking camera experience in WhatsApp on iOS, so screen reader users can hear a spoken description of what's in the viewfinder to better frame their photos and videos. But we're also actively engaged in advocacy, advancing accessibility even beyond Facebook. In 2020, Facebook was the first company to take the Global Accessibility Day pledge, committing publicly to making React Native accessible. This mobile app development framework was originally created by Facebook, but we turned it into an open source project, making it available to everyone. And now it's used by hundreds of mobile app developers who've created thousands of apps with it. We're also working to advance accessibility technology standards through the World Wide Web Consortium, known as the W3C. Standards may not seem like that they're that glamorous, but this work is critical to enabling the robust, consistent, and reliable web and mobile app accessibility experiences that we're all striving for. We also co-founded and continue to be active members of the Teach Access Initiative, bringing together industry, academia, and advocacy to gather and transfer accessibility best practices from industry back into education, so the next generation of technologists are better prepared to create accessible experiences, and we can achieve the goal of ensuring that all future technologies are born accessible. We're also a member of the XR Association, which is dedicated to publishing and advancing policies for safe and accessible extended reality products like AR and VR. Recently, Facebook was a key contributor in the development of the XR Association's Developer Guide for Accessibility, one of the first references of its kind. Speaking of XR, we're on the cusp of some truly incredible opportunities for advancing accessibility. We've even been researching the use of something called electromyography to create technologies that will make it possible to recreate the strength and dexterity of a person's hand in a virtual environment, even when that's missing or extremely limited in the physical world. We're pretty excited about the future, and as you can tell, we're hard at work advancing disability awareness, action, and advocacy on multiple fronts, both inside and outside Facebook. But we also recognize there is still a lot of work to do, and it's an honor to be leading this work at Facebook and to be working so closely with so many disability communities and advocates around the world. So on behalf of Facebook, we look forward to continuing this journey together. Thank you so much for your time.
And with that, we can move to the panel discussion. We have a panel of 5 esteemed speakers, and I will briefly introduce them. Starting with Dr. Nirmita Narasimhan, is a senior fellow and program director with the Global Initiative for Inclusive ICT. She works with Saksham Trust, a CSO empowering persons with blindness. Nirmita has served on several government committees, such as the Committee to Draft the National Policy on Universal Electronics Accessibility and the Committee to Revise the Guidelines for Indian Government Websites, and is involved in influencing policy for accessibility and inclusion in the region. We also have with us Ali Shabar. He's a digital innovator and the co-founder and CEO of DeafTalk, an award-winning app that bridges the communications gap between the deaf community and the rest of society. Next, we have Bhaskar Bhattacharjee. He's our government policy representative today and is the national consultant for accessibility in the A2I program of the Bangladesh government. He developed Bangladesh's first accessible dictionary to make learning English and Bangla language easier for readers with visual disabilities, among his various achievements in this space. Next, we have Charita Ratvata. He's the head of group sustainability at Dialogue Axiata and has been a driving force of the MNO championing an innovative and inclusive digital services aimed at marginalized communities, including rural, low-income communities, as well as for persons with disabilities. And finally, we have Monica Desai, the global head of connectivity and access policy at Facebook, where she focuses on issues involving infrastructure, spectrum, accessibility, online communication service providers, and net neutrality. Prior to joining Facebook, she spent over a decade in senior positions at the Federal Communications Commission in the US, including leading their work on accessibility. Thank you all for making the time to be here today. And let me dive straight into our discussion. So as we saw from the GSMA's presentation, it shows that there's still a large disability gap in mobile phone ownership, particularly when it comes to smartphone ownership. Some of the other insights on awareness and usage of mobile internet paint a rather grim picture of how exclusive the digital world is for people with disabilities. Despite this, over the past few years, there's been some marked progress on improving the digital inclusion of people with disabilities. I want to ask each panelist to briefly share what they believe are the most notable improvements and perhaps reflect a bit on the areas where your organization have been directly involved. I will start with Bhaskar. perhaps you can give your views given your vast experience at the intersection of ICT and disabilities.
Thank you very much. You know, ICT is now a key tool for a person with disabilities to overcome their disabilities. And UN Convention, CRPD, Article 9 and Article 21 has given create lots of opportunity for the people with disabilities as it's create accessible and barrier-free ICT environment in our region. As you know, I'm working with the Bangladesh government as a national consultant accessibility. I'm a person with visual disability. Because of my technology, because of my ICT knowledge, today I am working in such a position where I am driving the government policies and activities inclusive for people with disabilities. Digital Bangladesh initiative already mentioned the digital inclusion issues very clearly. And we have a law that is Persons with Disability Rights and Protection Act 2013. Under the law, there is a separate section for digital inclusion and accessibility, which was followed by the UNCRPD Article 9 and Article 21. So ICT is vital for people with disabilities in our region. For three issues I have identified for accessing ICTs. One is the accessibility. We found that accessibility is the biggest barrier for people with disabilities. Web are not accessible. Different technology, including applications, mobile, are not accessible. That's why people with disabilities are excluded from the ICTs and accessing information. Another is the affordability. Anyone can buy a smartphone by $50, but for a person with disabilities, it need around $150 because they need higher configuration. So they are not able to afford it. And many of the people with disabilities are poorest of the poor. All the assistive technologies are highly expensive. So it is another challenge for people with disabilities. Number three is awareness. There is no positive awareness regarding people with disabilities, how they can use the information communication technology, etc. That's why many people with disabilities are excluded. The policymaker, companies, tech companies, mobile phone companies, they are really not designing their service inclusive and accessible, as they have no idea that how people with disabilities are using information communication technology, mobile technology through their assistive technology. So this is another biggest challenge for people with disabilities in our region. In our country, almost 16 million people have some kind of disabilities. Bangladesh government already developed a database of 2.2 million people. It's intensive database. So, and we saw we already able to innovate some technology. You already mentioned, such as we have developed a full text, full audio, multimedia talking book. All the textbooks, grade 1 to grade 12, are now accessible for people with disabilities. We are providing free books to the students with disabilities. And we have innovated accessible dictionary. You can visit www.accessibledictionary.gov.bd. Anyone can use it. It is accessible for all types of people with disabilities. Now we are designing a e-learning platform for people with disabilities, so they can learn online, as now COVID has given restricted us in home. So there is no alternative of e-learning. So government have developed a platform. It's called imperia.gov.bd. Anyone can learn from the Imperia website. Also, we are trying to make our national helpline inclusive and accessible for all. That is 333, by including text and audio-based communication. And then anyone can communicate and get the service from national helpline. Another biggest intervention we are going to, our government has going to make, that is MyGov. That is mygov.gov.bd. 4,000 e-service will included in this service. So now we are working to make it accessible and inclusive for all. Because if we are not able to make it inclusive and accessible, then many people with disabilities will be excluded. That's why we are giving highest priority to make the MyGov accessible and inclusive for all. And finally,
thank you so much.
Finally, Bangladesh government are drafting a national web accessibility policy. I am requesting friends and colleagues, you can collaborate with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bhaskar, identifying some of the challenges and also areas where there's been progress from your perspective. I will move on to our next panelist, Nirmita. G3 ICT also works at the intersection of ICT and disabilities. What, in your opinion, are the greatest advancements made in this space?
Sure. So I'd like to draw your attention to 4 or 5 things which I think can qualify as good advancement in the space. Firstly, internationally, there's been a lot of movement on treaties, policies, and awareness amongst member states. So we've seen after the UNCRPD, especially in the Asia Pacific and Global South region, we've seen a lot of commitments like Incheon Strategy, Beijing Declaration, and these have had a ripple effect on countries coming up with policies and legislations to reflect the need for digital accessibility. So that is a good development. Secondly, I think a lot of standardization is happening internationally, which is more harmonized with, EN and 508 and all these. And again, because of their international commitments and a collaboration with OPDs, you do come across countries slowly, realizing that they need to follow standards. At least that awareness has come. Third, I would say there is some emerging leadership in many of the countries in Asia Pacific. And with OPD partnership, we also see that there is some capability and capacity to develop your own assistive technologies and build in your own language support, as demonstrated by Bhaskar himself in the previous speaker. He's done a lot of work in Bangladesh, and I think this needs to be recognized. I'd like to give an example of Braille Me in India, which is a refreshable Braille display developed in India. And until 2 years ago, Braille displays used to cost $2,500. And now Braille Me costs around $400 to $500, and it's getting marketed globally. Now, unfortunately, we don't have so many examples of these success stories, but I think we need to pause and understand that this needs to be recognized and this needs to be supported, and this is happening. We see more OPDs getting empowered and getting knowledgeable. And more people from developing countries coming onto the global stage. And the last point I'd like to make for this question is, I think social media is really transformed, along with the embedded technologies that one finds in Android and Apple. There are so many assistive technologies there, and they've really opened up an entire world of knowledge, communication, exchange of resources, and it's completely transformed life. And I think this is just starting. And yeah, I think that I end my intervention for this question.
Thank you, Nirmita, for pointing out how some of the frameworks, standards, and some of these products have also markedly improved. I want to give the word to Ali. DefTalk provides an innovative service for hearing impaired users. Could you share a little bit more about what DefTalk does and give your perspective on the most notable improvements on digital inclusion to date?
Surely, first of all, thank you to GSM and Facebook for highlighting such an important issue on that particular day. DefTalk, from the word, it clearly understands that we are working for the empowerment of deaf community. Just imagine if somebody visits to a doctor but unable to explain the pain because doctor doesn't know his or her language. That's 466 million deaf community across the globe facing that particular challenge every single day in their life. And we are not talking about the minority in Asia as well. It's 256 million who are facing that particular problem because of limited sign language interpreters. It's how we started. Basically, one of my co-founders, who's Vamek, he's deaf by birth, and he was in the 5th grade when he was kicked out of school. And he went to US to avail this facility. After 15 years of his education career in US, he did the computer engineering and came back to Pakistan only to realize the challenge is still there. And that's how we bridge this gap by providing online sign language interpretation services through our mobile application, which is available on both iOS and Android platform. We piloted from Pakistan and now scaled to Singapore market. Sooner we'll be launching the services in Sri Lanka with Dialogue as well. So that's how we are bridging this gap by connecting deaf users with qualified and certified sign language interpreters via video calling solution on just one click. And it's, in short, you can say we are the Ubers or GRAP for sign language interpreters for the deaf community. Almost is 3 years of operations. We have rendered more than 120,000 hours of sign language services, and we have active 19,000 users from both Pakistan and Singapore market.
It's very impressive numbers and reach you're sharing, Ali. Thank you for that. I'll move to Charita. What would you say have been the greatest advancements made within the mobile industry in this area?
Yeah, thanks, Tom, and thanks everyone. This is a very valuable and important conversation that we are having. I would actually, when you go back and think about this, short message service, SMS, was possibly, and this came way back in 1992 with the second generation, was itself something where people could type something and explain it and share it with each other on the phone, even if they could not understand sign language or anything. And I personally was blown away when I first saw a person with hearing difficulty having a very rapid conversation on a video call with someone else. And so that is one of those first moments where I understood, we like to think that our technologies are very value adding, but where it could be something particularly value adding for certain categories of users. And then of course we ended up with supercomputers in our pockets. And I think that is where the real capability to do so much for people at a device level, but also taking advantage of the cloud has really, started paying a lot of dividends. So I think the next thing that came along, computer vision, voice recognition, screen readers with those smart devices, I think have been, from my observation, very value adding. OS level support. So when you, as Dr. Nimita mentioned about standardization, when you could start, having the same settings on each phone and being required by the developers, I think was a major one. More recently, we've seen apps like Seeing AI, Loudsteps, DefTalk, as Ali mentioned, we are working on bringing it to Sri Lanka as well. And another app that I'll mention again later as well, called Petrelex, using the advantages of these devices. So I'll stop there, but I think that's kind of the curve that we have seen on where these devices and their advancing capabilities have been able to help.
Thank you, Charita, for taking us on that journey from SMS to smartphones, operating systems to apps. I'll move onwards to Monica. What's your view on this, and what have been specific achievements on accessibility at Facebook?
Sure. Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you, everyone, for having me, and I'm very honored to be invited and to be a part of this group. As you heard earlier, our mission at Facebook is to give people the power to build community and bring the world closer together, and that means everyone. So making products accessible to people with disabilities is critical to getting our mission right. As Mike Shabanik, our head of product accessibility at Facebook, mentioned, we have focused significant efforts on improving the accessibility of videos and photos on our platform, as well as significant efforts through captioning and automatic alt text, respectively. Our goal is for every video on Facebook to have captions, and one of our biggest advances related to captioning is by investing in and leveraging artificial intelligence technologies to enable automated captioning for videos. Mike talked about automatic alt text, which allows people with vision disabilities to hear what's in a picture. And that technology uses object recognition to generate a description of photos to enable people using screen readers to hear a list of items that may appear in a photo. That can provide additional context about a photo, such as the count of recognized objects, positional information, and a comparison of the relative prominence of objects in a particular image. The research and engagement with people who are blind or have vision loss, or people who have hearing loss, is really in general, as well as other disabilities, is a really important part of making advancements possible. You know, as Bhaskar mentioned when he was speaking, it's really important to understand what the challenges are in order to make products that are more accessible. And you can't do that without working closely with the people who are specifically impacted in different ways. And Mike also mentioned the importance of driving innovation and accessibility that extends beyond Facebook, which is really important for us. And that's why we not only co-founded, but continue to be an active member of Teach Access, which is a collaboration among industry, academia, and advocacy that seeks to advance accessibility teaching in higher education, with the goal of ensuring that graduates are well prepared to make future technologies born accessible. This includes creating best practices and teaching best practices for accessible software design in order to advance accessibility training in higher education. So we're honored that this particular collaboration has won awards and recognitions, including by the Federal Communications Commission. So I'll stop there, but thank you for that opportunity to talk about that.
Thank you so much, Monica. I think everyone has shared some of the significant progress and improvements we've seen over the last year in this space. I want to switch gears a little bit and ask about what would you say are the main barriers for digital inclusion that we need to tackle first, and how do we do this? I'll give the word to Nirmata to respond first, please.
Sure. So I think for every positive that we have, there is a side for improvement. And I'd like to refer to a survey which G3ICT conducts with the Disabled Persons International every year, which is called the Digital Accessibility Rights Evaluation Index, the DARE Index. And the DARE Index is revealed that the average score out of 100 for countries in South Asia and in Asia Pacific is around 33 to 36 out of 100 on implementation, while most of our countries are really ahead on commitments. Around 80 to 85% I have committed through laws and policies and signing the UNCRPD. So there is obviously a huge gap in implementing. There's a huge gap in capacity and capability, which we need to address. The other small challenges, I feel that while on one hand we need to address affordability of devices, we also need to ensure that all devices, even those which are really low end, support accessibility features. And we don't find that standardized support of accessibility across devices. And that unless you bring accessibility features, you make them available even on lower end devices, it's going to be very difficult to scale it up in countries. Right now, a lot of vision impaired people who are using mobile phones have higher end smartphones. And if you look at the other, it's the other disabilities probably who have the other phones. So that is one thing which I think needs to be addressed. And again, from a service perspective, I think there are so many apps out there and they are not compatible. So even if you have the assistive technology, you are not able to access because people are not conforming to standards. So that is a huge challenge. We are still waiting for talking about website accessibility, and now we've added mobile accessibility onto it. And that again is a huge barrier. Third one is access to content and resources in your own language. So we need content and resources in native languages, and this has to be generated locally. It cannot come from outside. So that support needs to happen.
Thank you so much, Nirmata. And in particular, the point you're making about some of these barriers being compounding, especially when it comes to affordability and disabilities. Bhaskar, I'd also like to invite you to share your views on some of the main barriers for digital inclusion.
One of the most important barrier I observe, that is the lack of participation of people with disabilities. We are just seeing that people with disabilities are not in any forums where the accessibility issues are addressed, such as the companies are not really considering people with disabilities as expert, even though the policymakers, government, UN agencies are not really considering people with disabilities as expert or decision maker. We are just coming as a clap giver. Don't count me. I am only one here in Bangladesh, but not many people with disabilities are in a position where they can share their expertise. So when you design something by excluding us, then the result is not really up to the mark. Secondly, a policy intervention. Even though we have laws, but there is no guideline, accessibility guideline in our regions. Maybe India have one, but many of our South Asian countries don't have the national standard for accessibility, web accessibility, etc. Even though we have an international standard like W3C or DAISY standard, etc., but which are not highly implemented in our countries, or government are not adopting this standard as a national standard. Third is that procurement. There is no accessibility procurement toolkits or tools or any training or awareness. That's why many products where our governments or non-government sector are purchasing, which are not accessible or inclusive for people with disabilities. Fourth is I already told you, the poverty. People with disabilities are the poorest of the poor in our region, and they are not able to buy or a sophisticated technology. Lastly, I'd like to mention one important point, that is the commitment. If any government or community have the commitment, then we can overcome all the challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhaskar. I think we're all in agreement, particularly to the point you made about the importance of involving people with disabilities as programs and products are developed. Monica, what should Facebook and similar companies be focusing their efforts on to improve accessibility?
I can speak for Facebook, and our priorities are, we have several priorities. We want to improve accessibility by continuing to engage with and collecting perspectives from different communities of people with disabilities and across the globe. Continuing to improve and deliver products and services that give people with disabilities a voice, access to markets and information, and the ability to better interact with family and friends, employers, society in general. We will continue to work through global organizations like the World Wide Web Consortium to advance interoperability standards for assistive technologies. We want to focus on improving mobile device accessibility, as Dr. Narsim emphasized, through our commitment to making open source software available, open source development tools available. And we want accessibility to flourish beyond our own products. We think a great area to focus on as well is advancing the application of artificial intelligence and machine learning for the benefit of people with disabilities. A lot of opportunity and promise there. We want to engage in industry-wide initiatives to ensure next generation technologies like augmented reality and virtual reality are accessible and are leveraged for these particular benefits. And then, of course, as I mentioned, we want to promote and support initiatives like Teach Access that promote accessibility and raise awareness of people with disabilities and promote their employment.
Thank you, Monica. I want to give the word to Charita, reflecting on some of the barriers that GSMA has identified in their insights. What should the mobile industry be focusing on?
Thanks, Tom. So from an industry point of view, the voice and the data businesses are becoming almost utility level. The pricing is following, but these are shareholder-owned businesses that need to have sustainable business models. The price of voice and data have, voice came down first and data is following very rapidly, but these networks still need to function as businesses. So they are all regulated, prices have come down, but still we know that cost can be one of the biggest issues for particularly any kind of customer in our part of the world. But possibly more so for people with disability who may be facing challenges from the start. Their families may face challenges economically, and as they become users themselves. So that is one of those thorny issues that requires people from all parts, economists, maybe anthropologists, regulators, everybody to really have a conversation about how you can do this, because of course operators are concerned about cannibalization, right? We start making regulators in the first place have even to approve special kinds of services and packages that may be different for people with disabilities. My own colleagues as well as regulators are concerned about how would you be able to identify, because this is an economic term. It may sound bad, but price discrimination is something that companies need to be able to perform. But how can we best serve customers who may have genuine challenges while not endangering our larger business is something that we have a conversation we have been having for a few years inside Dialog. And I mean, several of these countries have the lowest rates in the world for voice and data, where it still may be a perceived or actual issue. So coming up with these sustainable models, and there are different models maybe we can talk about later, but where you can make this work, even for the providers of technology. For example, people like DevTalk and others, they need to have a sustainable business model to continue to serve more and more customers. So these are some of the challenges I think that we need to focus on.
Thank you, Charita, for sharing that perspective. Ali, in your opinion, what's the innovator's perspective on how some of these barriers can be overcome?
Sure. Basically, there are 2 points. One is the understanding the accessibility challenge. The UNCRPD Article 1 says all rights for all persons with disabilities. And it comes again for the accessibility as well. But unfortunately, in digital accessibility, we always refer for persons with visual impairment. What about the accessibility barriers faced by deaf community, intellectual disabilities, and psychosocial disabilities? It should be taken as a holistic model of accessibility, because every disability has their own needs of accessibility, and it can be easily covered through technology nowadays. On the other side, if we talk about the challenges particularly faced by the hearing community, there's a huge demand. And I would love to ask from 2 authorities, because both are present here. One is GSMA and other is Facebook as a tech giant, is the regulation of VoIP services. Like deaf community cannot able to use the calling or GSM services in order to call to take an appointment from the doctor or order a pizza or many other GSM call services. Facebook is the innovator of VoIP, and GSM is the regulator who needs to regulate that mobile operators do not take VoIP services as a competition, but it's an accessibility tool for the hearing impairment. And through that, they can have at least access to the 5% of the global population. More importantly, standards are there, but there should have certain backbiting laws who has teeth in their own regulators or in their own capacities in the national level or local level of contacts, where accessibility means have to be ensured at all levels.
Some interesting challenges outlined there by Ali. Charita or Monica, would you like to share any thoughts on that?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. Those are great points, Ali. And when I worked at the Federal Communications Commission, I was heavily involved in a program called Video Relay Services. I'm sure you're familiar with those in the United States. It's a very strong program, and it would be interesting to see if it could be replicated in other parts of the globe. But essentially, one of the challenges that when I was working there, we were hearing a lot about the difficulty of contacting a doctor's office to make an appointment, for example, or contacting just talking to your employer about some specific issue if you're, away from the office. And it was a great program to be able to connect to an interpreter through a broadband connection using a video relay service. I think WhatsApp and other Facebook services have come up as well, and more service providers are using WhatsApp to communicate and make appointments, and I think that's making things a little bit easier. But I'd be, curious to understand, what are some of the different types of ways governments across the globe are addressing, that particular practical issue.
Thank you. I think Monica also touches upon the complex nature of some of these challenges and how it will require multi-stakeholder discussions like this, which is a good segue into the next question I wanted to ask all of the panelists. Looking at the variety of organizations represented in this panel, it's evident that the commitment and effective collaboration will be foundational to driving improved digital inclusion for people with disabilities. Bhaskar, can you share more on what you view as the critical role of government in driving digital inclusion of persons with disabilities, and maybe some examples of good government-driven initiatives?
One of the biggest challenges we face when we work with the government is still they believe, people with disabilities is a very small part of the citizen. So why we will invest to make the service accessible or inclusive? This is a general view. And also the government people always see as in a charity model. You will be very surprised to see in our country, almost 2 million persons with disabilities are covered by the social safety net. So we are just suggesting we don't need the social safety net. We need the computer, we need the laptop. So it is very difficult to convince the policymaker as there is not many example already ready in our system. People are now seeing that people with disabilities are equally able to perform with like others if they have the technology. So we need to create some example. Without an example, maybe government are not able to understand about our ability or how we can contribute through contribution through ICTs. Even though government have huge commitment, that's why government are investing resource for developing new technologies, developing several, making this information accessible. But still we are far behind. And even though we have a very, very effective law, like we have a national action plan, etc., but implementation is very, very poor. And lastly, I would like to say only 4% people with disabilities have education. That means 96% are not even went to school. So it's a big challenge for us, how we can accommodate them through the technology. And also all the sophisticated technology are not available in our country. Maybe softwares are there. Still, we are not using any expensive technology. We are using free and open source technology. Whatever screen reading software I am today using, that is free. We are using NVDA. And thank you to the organization like GSMA, Facebook, even G3ICT. I am the country representative of G3ICT in Bangladesh. So they are really collaborating with us. That's why we are really progressing. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhaskar. I'm going to move on to Monica. Can you share your perspective on the role of the private sector and perhaps share some examples of multi-stakeholder efforts to design innovative tools, features, programs to address the needs of Facebook users with disabilities?
Of course, the work being done through multi-stakeholder efforts is so important to improving accessibility, and Facebook does play a role in those in various efforts. One example we mentioned is our work through web and assistive technology improvements while by working with the World Wide Web Consortium and working groups. You may be aware that this is the most important accessibility-focused web framework for making the languages that style web pages such as HTML, JS, CSS, and more accessible. Specifically, we're helping write the ARIA authoring practices guide. ARIA stands for Accessible, Rich, Interactive Applications, and it's a set of attributes that define ways to make web content and web applications more accessible to people with disabilities. And the work that I mentioned previously on Teach Access is also a key part of our efforts to advance accessibility in higher education.
Thank you. Nirmata, you have a lot of experience working with multilateral organizations, for instance, the UN and ITU as examples. What's the role they can play in driving digital inclusion for persons with disabilities?
Yeah, I think UN organizations perform 2 or 3 important roles. First, of course, is to promote good policies amongst member states and bring them together in mutual agreement, promote standardization, and provide support through technical resources or funding or knowledge resources in any way to push for adoption and implementation of digital accessibility.
Can you also reflect on the important role of OPDs, organizations of persons with disabilities, and the role they can play in driving digital inclusion themselves?
Sure. I think OPDs are critical to pushing digital accessibility. We have evidence to show that wherever in the world there has been some significant policy development or there has been implementation, it has been driven by OPDs. Otherwise, it's lacking, and it's also important for OPDs to have a good knowledge of and understanding of ICT and ICT accessibility. So one of the things G3 ICT has done is that we've launched a DARE scholarship to help OPDs get accessibility certification from IEEP. But the sad fact is that if you look at the world in general, and APAC region is no exception, there is hardly 26% world over and 21% in Asia Pacific specifically, where organizations are usually involved in policy making processes or involved in product development and everywhere. So that's a sad fact, and that's, I think, something we really need to work on.
Important points mentioned there. Charita, I also want to get your views on this. What's the role of the mobile industry, and how does Dialogue view their role in driving the digital inclusion of persons with disabilities?
Yeah, well, we like to think, or we like to say that these are liberating, democratizing, potentially transformation technologies. So now it's time, this is the kind of thing where we need to walk the talk. So one thing we have going for us in the tech industry is, of course, it's faster, better, cheaper, more. There's a technology learning curve with most of these things that works for us to help us get more out of every dollar that somebody has to spend. We have been doing a lot, for example, with some of the work we have done is just about looking for the free services or creating free services or partnering to get cheaper services to our local customers, localizing wherever possible, and partnering to kind of deliver and get these things to people. For example, what we will be doing with DevTalk and what we have already done with another app called Petralex, which we are localizing the name as well. That's a Russian developer. Being, having a lot of engineers at organizations like ours, our first response is to try to build something ourselves, but then we realized that there are globally people who have done much better at and have a lot more experience at these things. So working with them to build in local languages and local context, and then take that to more users. So the value add that we as Dialogue in a tiny country, tiny market, what we can give is things like direct carrier billing, where people can who don't have credit cards or who don't have other electronic payment methods can still pay for these services just by adding it to their bill. So those are the kinds of things where we have a value add for both the partners as well as for the customers to be able to do this. So these are a couple of examples. There are others, where a gap exists that has not been filled at all. We have built them. For example, we built a localized AAC, so augmentative alternative communication tool for people with speech difficulties, completely free, completely at our cost, that people can download and use, which has some cloud-based features for the customized tiles and things like that. So, but where possible, we try to partner. And so we have a philosophy at Dialog. We call it the 4 A's, something similar, I think Mr. Vashka mentioned. And these go in order. First is affordability. If people can't afford it, that's it. Nothing, you're not going any further. So focus for digital inclusion, affordability has to be number one. Then availability. Does it work on my tech? Is it available where I am? Is it in, all those things? Then applicability. We found this not only with people with disabilities, but again, this was referenced by a few other panelists. But if it's not solving genuine problems for me, most of the time, it's not going to get a lot of attention from me. And then finally, affinity. I mean, one of the things that I also use this to sell to people in industry is you also get a lot of loyalty from users if you are solving problems. That this is not only people with disabilities, but from this kind of user, we've seen a lot of loyalty and willingness to stick with us. So that is a carrot for our finance team as well, but just something to show that, there is a give and take involved here.
Thank you, Charita. I think it's important you highlight the importance of partnership in the initial part of your response. And we really should see partnerships as being essential to innovation that we've seen in digital assistive tech in the past few years. Ali, from your perspective, what are the main contributing factors for this increase in assistive digital tech? And how can we drive more innovation for digital accessibility?
Yeah. Well, if we talk about the accessibility for the deaf and what DeafTalk is doing, that we will be launching AI bot services for sign language interpretation, because we understand the problem is huge, and with real-time human interpreters, that problem cannot be addressable. So we need machine to learn sign language and bridge that communication gap, because we believe barrier breaks when communication starts. So that's what hopefully in this year, by September, we will be launching the AI services, the human-less interpretation services in 6 different languages. So deaf people have more control toward their own communication. On the other side, we will be integrating VoIP services in Pakistan so that deaf users can utilize mobile phones and communicate to anyone generally who doesn't have the mobile DeafTalk application or do not know the sign language through their mobile phones or GSM calls. That's the other part. Thirdly, what we will be envisioning in future, that we can be the Google translator for the deaf community, because it's another language. And when there are translators available, why not for the sign language interpretation, or translators can be done, so that 500 million deaf community can be part of this mainstream society and take full and effective participation. And I would love to thank you, Dialog, Facebook, GSMA, to contributing and partnering with DeafTalk in that particular part, making accessibility for the deaf community.
Excellent. And I'll throw the next question to Monica. What are some of the more innovative ways that Facebook and other tech companies have tackled issues of accessibility of their digital services and products, and what's been the impact of these efforts?
Oh, sure. Happy to answer that. I know Mike Shvanik touched on a lot of the innovations that we've been able to execute over the last couple of years. But for context, I want to say that I previously led accessibility at the Federal Communications Commission and had oversight over the development and implementation of accessibility policies and rules. And through that, I had the joy of speaking with many companies in many sectors about accessibility policies and how they were implementing those. And after joining, and sometimes it was a joy and sometimes it was a challenge speaking to some companies. But after joining Facebook, I was really in awe when I saw how truly committed we are and our engineers are to including people with disabilities as we build access to the information and connections that happen across our products and services. And as has been emphasized a couple times in this panel, by Bhaskar and by Ali and others, it's really important to understand what the problems are or the challenges are, and to really work with people with disabilities in order to address those challenges. One of the most satisfying parts of my job has been seeing the difference that our products really are making for people with disabilities. I recognize there's always room for improvement, but what I've seen has been really heartening. When we launched our new version of automatic alt text, the head of one organization for the blind said that when we launched it into the stratosphere, and he wished other problems were as susceptible to such elegant solutions. And that was certainly an unprompted remark and comment that came from an organization we work with. And, I recognize we still have a long way to go on many of our products, but I'm glad to see that we're making a difference. But I'm actually most excited to say that I think the best is yet to come. For example, I think there's tremendous potential to improve the lives of people with mobility disabilities through virtual reality and augmented reality. Mark Zuckerberg said that those technologies are all about giving people remote presence. So if you're on VR and AR and on video chat, and you have to believe in some capacity that you're helping people be able to do whatever they want from wherever they are. Enabling remote presence with family and friends, enabling remote work and civic participation are obviously essential, but accessing virtual reality doesn't have to stop there. We also believe that virtual reality will support virtual reality simulations that allow people with reduced mobility to explore inaccessible real environments, for example, cultural heritage sites. Last month, Mark Zuckerberg experienced a VR reconstruction of the mausoleum of Augustus in Rome, and which is the final resting place of the first Roman emperor and the largest circular tomb in the world. And with technologies like VR, we can make this type of experience more accessible for those who may otherwise have difficulty traveling to such places.
Thank you so
I
much.
apologize in advance. I'm going to have to hop in a second because I'm going to be joining another event in Europe shortly. So I'm excited that we've got events across the globe, but I really want to thank GSMA as great partners in these efforts, and thank the panel. And I really have learned a lot from listening to so many perspectives. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica. Just want to remind all the folks we have in the audience that you can share your questions in the Q&A, which we will be moving straight onwards to now. I'll start with a question we've received from Helen Osborne from the ADB. What works to support inclusion of persons with disabilities into digital employment? Maybe I could invite Nirmita to have a go at that first.
Sure. I think access to technologies, computer, mobile phone, assistive technologies, accessible communication, good supporting environment, flexible practices. I think there needs to be a focal point in communication between the employers and the employees as to what works for them. I think these would be the starting point for digital employment.
Thank you, Nirmata. I also want to go to the next question we've gotten in the chat from Haran. And this is for Clara from the GSMA, who gave the introductory presentation. Why is the smartphone gap high among persons with disabilities? Is it because disability is highly skewed to older age groups and they use basic phones? Smartphone use among young people is higher, and so the phone disability gap should be lower. But if it's still high, what could be the reasons?
Thanks, Tom, for the question. Thanks, Haran, for the question. I'm going to make reference to two studies that we have recently concluded. We received funding from the FCDO for us to be able to do this work. And we had partner researchers that conducted the work with us. So the studies were done in Kenya, in Ghana, and in Sri Lanka. And they were dedicated studies for us to understand the digital inclusion of people with disabilities in this country. So the methodology is slightly different to the research that I presented earlier. Now, because of how we collected the data, we're actually able to disaggregate by different groups. So the first answer is yes, age is an important factor. So we see that, interestingly, the younger and the older groups have lower levels of mobile ownership in both countries. So we are seeing in the data in both countries that the middle group, and I'll tell you what the middle group is, but the middle group has higher levels of mobile ownership. But now this middle group, which in Sri Lanka are people between the ages of 35 and 65, and in Ghana there are people between the ages of 25 and 55 years old or over. People have really high levels of basic and feature phones. So it is true that younger people have higher levels of smartphone ownership, but older groups, or not even older, but the middle group that has the higher levels of mobile ownership in general, they tend to have basic and feature phones. Now, the younger groups, we can assume that they have lower, the younger and the older groups, we can assume that they have lower levels of mobile ownerships because they probably also have lower levels of, or lower access to employment opportunities. So this is when affordability becomes a really, really great barrier, which is one of the points that Charissa mentioned. So it's one of the greatest barriers to their inclusion. So it is likely that people in the middle group are the people that are actually employed and they are able to afford a certain level of mobile products and mobile services. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Clara, for those additional insights. The next question we received is for Bhaskar. It's from Tim Adlam, who's asking, how can technology for digital access to education best integrate into education delivery in remote areas? Will education delivery be forever different after the COVID pandemic?
Thank you very much. You know, we have some kind of innovation in education. As I told you, like that, we innovated full text, full audio, multimedia talking book, which is accessible for all, even the low literate, the parents who never ever went to school. They can listen book, their children can read the book. I can give you one example, like I am a blind person and my daughter can see. So this is the inspiration for innovating these types of technology. So if you ask me like how you're bringing this technology to the rural community, yes, we have innovated another technology is called accessible book reader. This is an Android-based book reader, very cheap, only less than $50. And government are distributing this book reader free. Already 2,000 accessible book reader freely distributed among the rural children with disabilities. So by accommodating the textbook. So these types of innovation is highly useful and productive for the grassroots level of people with disabilities, especially children with disabilities. And also, you know, community radio can play a vital role. In our during this COVID pandemics, we saw that our government have number of classes have taken by the radio, especially community radio, by engaging community radio. Even though there is many people already have some kind of feature phone and a smartphone also, So we are just there is some kind of innovation we are planning, like people with disabilities can call, that would be a toll-free number, and they can get some content, educational content and they can listen. Lastly, I can tell you, like we need to identify some indigenous technology to bring the innovation in the rural part of the different country, as there is no electricity, etc. So we are using solar based system for getting these types of innovation in the very rural part of the country.
Thank you, Ashkar. The next question we've received is for Ali. It's from Paul Horsters. What are, from your perspective, the greatest barriers for persons with disabilities in Asia to become tech entrepreneurs and therefore promoting inclusive design of tech?
That's a very interesting question. That if we talk about the holistic, the Asian tech ecosystem, now it's very, very building up. And if we're taking it's in two parts. One is those who has a very robust tech system like Singapore, Indonesia, Vietnam, India. They have much more technology companies or startup ecosystem, startup companies who are working on the accessibility part as well as on solving the problems for the persons with disabilities. They have the investments, they have the proven business models. But if we talk about the countries like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, where this ecosystem is at a very infancy stage and it's building up, there we have challenges. The first challenge is the policy challenge is a big one, where the payment gateways is the critical part where you need to adopt a global payment gateway methods, which is a pretty expensive one as compared to the local one. On the other side, many deaf, blind, or maybe intellectual disabilities have limited access to that payment gateways in order to avail that services and pay that for it. Third, the major challenge is the investment side. That many of the time, people concerning the segment of persons with disability are very bare segment, and most of the time, investor feels that it's not very scalable. It's not very robust one where they have ROIs, return on investments. But believe us, it is a real business proposition, because if we cumulatively talk about the community of persons with disabilities, 10 to 15% of the total population in whole Asia. And we can easily devise the unit economics, and it can be easily positive bottlenecks of every business. But it's just a matter that how we define the problem and how we create the solution which is acceptable by this community. Because as all the panelists explained, involvement of persons with disabilities, finding that solution is the key role. So it's important that when we define the problem, the solution should be from the community, from the user's perspective.
Thank you so much, Ali. I want to give the last question to Charita. Could you also share from your perspective any insights on promising digital innovations to improve inclusion of persons with disabilities into employment?
Well, it shouldn't be a surprise now, but working from home, right? Because it equalizes a lot of things that otherwise, we would have people with all their faculties would have advances, but suddenly, it democratizes everything. So I would say that might be the one that has opened a lot of eyes of people to what is possible. There have been, so building on that, the more recent, again, these are not necessarily, these are tech enabled, but I wouldn't say that these are tech innovations by themselves. But, over the last, say, 5 to 10 years, people like Amazon have had the Mechanical Turk, and there have been services like Elancer and others, where people could do small amounts of work, picking the work that they could do and when they could do it. More recently, a good friend of mine has started a company called Odeta.ai that is specifically at the moment focused on women because they have their own challenges, many women, particularly in developing parts of the world. But I am very keen on working with Kat, my friend, as well as others, to see how we can take this general model of where people who may have challenges getting to a place of work, working in a certain environment that maybe is the standard one provided by an employer or in a particular context, but can still contribute with their own talents. So we can overcome some of those figures by using technology to replace them. I think that is a very exciting thing.
Thank you so much, Charita. Let's hope you're right.
Yeah, I remembered an old joke. There was, I think, a New Yorker cartoon, two dogs in front of a computer talking to each other and saying, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog, right? So, I mean, nobody knows who they're dealing with, and they need not know. That's, I think, one of the great things about this kind of remote work.
And hopefully you're right that one of the silver linings of the situation we've been in the last 2 years is that it will lower the threshold for a more inclusive employment. I want to close out by posing a question to the entire panel. If we imagine a year from now, COVID is a thing of the past, fingers crossed, and we're celebrating GAD 2022. What is the one thing you want to see the industry having achieved, or rather, what's the one thing you hope we don't still need to try and advocate for, but we've actually started doing? I'll give the word to Nirmita first.
Sure. I think generally 1 year from now, we should not again still be talking about the need for web accessibility, and we should not be having to prove to people that mobile phones can really enhance accessibility and it need to be made available through devices and services. We should be going on to more advanced developments of technology.
Thank you, Nirmita. Then Ali, I want to give you the next opportunity to respond.
Well, for me, we would love to see that next year, all technology platforms will be accessible for the deaf community and providing all content such as video, text content into sign language.
Thank you, Ali. It was very concise and important. Charita, would you like to go next?
Yeah, building on something Ali mentioned earlier, actually, this coordination across countries, across regulatory environments also, I think could do a lot to simplify and to make it clearer for operators, cross-border companies, to give them the freedom to, take more effort, put more into things for accessibility without the concerns and others they would have when addressing other issues. So I think that could open up a lot of things. Thanks, Ali, for even mentioning that. I hadn't even thought of it.
Thank you, Charita. Last but not least, Lashkar, what is your expectation or hope for where we are 1 year from now?
Nothing about us without us. I believe the companies, tech companies, ICT provider, developer will consider people with disabilities as experts, and they will be the integral part of the development. We want a world where everyone will enjoy equal basis with others. Thank you.
Thank you, Lashkar. That's a very important and appropriate note for us to end on. I think that is all we have time for. We've received a number of questions we were unable to cover in this live session. but we will try to respond to those who've submitted questions over the chat after the event. With that, I would like to thank all of our excellent panelists and speakers for their inputs and interventions. This has been a great learning experience for all, I'm certain. I'd also like to thank all of our participants who've joined us from various parts of the world to listen to these experts, including those who shared their questions and comments with us during the session. Before we end, I'd like to share some of GSMA and Facebook's accessibility resources. We will share these in the chat, and you will be able to access them. They include details in a follow-up email that we will send, which you all will receive. We will also, after the event, send around a post-event survey, which we would very much welcome your responses to. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a good day. Thank you.